much for the warm welcome, Adrian, and great to be here and back again. I'd like to also extend the accolades and introduce briefly our panel. And I would hand over to each of you to quickly say a few words about yourselves, your role, function, and of course, up and foremost, your name before we dive into the discussion. Jamie, over to you.
Thanks, Martina. I'm Jamie Broderick. I'm Deputy Chair at the Impact Investing Institute, which is a nonprofit that was set up about 3.5 years ago to promote the flow of capital to investments that generate a social and environmental benefit alongside a financial return.
Good morning, I'm Denise and I chair the Brunel Pension Partnership. I also chair JP Morgan's UK retirement plan, their closed DB/DC scheme. And I also chair the Brightwell group, which is a segue to our illustrious CEO.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. So I'm the CEO of Brightwell. Brightwell manages the BT pension scheme and the EE pension scheme.
Hi, I'm Gus Wiseman. I'm the head of investor relations for the UK government. We manage relationships with around 400 institutional investors and venture capital funds around the world. And our job is to try to bring their capital into the areas where the UK needs it most. So where there's scarce capital that sits at the heart of our national missions around net zero and levelling up.
Wonderful. And my name is Martina Macpherson. I'm heading the ESG product management function at the Swiss and Spanish Stock Exchanges Group. I'm also the now new chair of the board of FOSTA, the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance. And I'm working in various roles across industry and academia and also on various advisory groups, one of them being the All-Party Parliamentary Group on ESG, Houses of Parliament UK. And we just issued, as of today, Alex Pawlowski's here in the room, contributed to this too, the latest report on gender equality and equity, which I'd like everyone to encourage to read because it has implications from a policy and obviously from a markets perspective. Thank you. But without further ado, quickly to get into today's discussion around the macroeconomic environment. Obviously, we cannot look at the macroeconomic developments without taking into account and consideration the microeconomic topics, issues, trends, and trajectories. And these are very closely interlinked with the role of the pension funds, the fiduciary management element that ultimately spans and oversees and connects the investment value chain from the pension fund's beneficiary and ultimately the consumer into what and where we see investment decision-making leading into hopefully the proactive engagement and the active ownership with change trajectories that are then being ideally implemented and followed by investee companies. I've seen there's an interesting study out by Schroders. I think they interviewed again 770 investor, more than 30 trillion, I think, assets under management. Some of these trajectories literally look at what we are discussing today about the geopolitical challenges, but also the importance and ever-increasing importance of areas of investing such as thematic investing and impact, net zero alignment, regulatory trajectories, and of course, when and where still maybe uncertainty or maybe even unclarity reigns when we look at the ever-increasing regulatory picture and the normatives framework that run side by side. But we really want to get to grips up and foremost with what is really driving the outcomes and impacts we would like to see, and the best practices and case studies that we can hear of, and where we bring in clearly the experts to highlight what is being achieved and what's already been actively addressed and done. So without further ado, I'd like to open the first question here to my panel, looking at ESG trends and trajectories, and when and where in the context of macroeconomic challenges and potentially microeconomic issues, when and where we see really opportunities for outcomes and impact. And who is not better placed than to answer this than Jamie?
Well, I think what's interesting is that the most pension funds and foundations have been around for, they invested with a time horizon of multiple decades. And so in a sense, the macroeconomic and geopolitical issues are a bit of part of the fluctuation, the vacillation that occurs. But fundamentally, these organizations have been through multiple versions of this. So I think fundamentally, what pensions and foundations are trying to do doesn't change that much. I think the one thing that does create change is a growing realization that investing needs to be done with a high awareness of the environmental and social implications of the investment, both implications for the health of the portfolio, but also the effect of the portfolio on the society and the environment. And I think net zero, the move to a low carbon environment, a low carbon economy, is the secular thing that's really changing. It's really, in my mind, I mean, we focus typically on the social issues more than the environmental issues. But there's no question that the move to a low carbon economy is driving all of this through whatever geopolitical vacillations are occurring. And I think that's really, it's really the net zero and the move to low carbon economy that has made it clear to people that the way you invest money has an impact on what society and the environment look like. And I think from that, in a sense, a lot of the social and other issues in sustainability and impact are riding on the slipstream of net zero.
Very much from a pension fund's perspective. Thank you, Jamie. Denise, could you give some reflections on how you are actively mandating for these type of activities and investments into thematics and/or impact, and what you have seen over time is changing here? And where do you see, maybe, where do bottlenecks and barriers to entry really remain? And again, what can be done about it?
Well, there's no doubt that the war in Ukraine and now further tensions have been a bit of a setback for the focus on energy in particular. But we are there for the long game, and that's noise. If you're thinking of investing for 20, 30 years, it doesn't change the fundamental. What I have a slight issue with is the word net zero and the obsession with data on portfolio management. To me, it's we have to have a just transition. We have to focus on the S, how we get there, what's the trajectory, what are people's intentions, companies' intentions, and people's intentions. There's no question that our members want us to be really focused on climate. But if one gets too lost in the weeds of data and data measurement, you end up, yes, you may be a net zero portfolio, but what are you doing to change the real economy? What are the outcomes that will come from having that net portfolio? And I think that we need to really bear that in mind when we're investing in companies. So for example, we invested in a giant warehouse, a greenhouse rather, in East Anglia, which was using water from a sewage treatment plant that was being dumped in the river and was causing some harm to the wildlife and the biometrics of those particular rivers. And by using that water to heat our greenhouses, we are now producing 10% of the tomatoes for the UK and cucumbers and green peppers, which were otherwise being imported. So that's the type of thing where you're killing many birds with one stone. And it's that type of investment that we really want to do more of in the UK. But and now this is leaning towards our dear friend at the end here. We lack opportunity in the UK. It's much easier to find projects like that elsewhere, like the US, for example, where senators welcome you with incentives, et cetera. And unfortunately, at this point in time, it doesn't feel like there will be much forth. There's a lot of talk about VC and greater investment in the UK infrastructure, but there aren't many carrots that I can see.
Denise, your comment about data reminds me of Oscar Wilde's comment about a cynic being somebody who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. In a sense, it's a similar thing. So the technical aspect is well known, but what does it actually mean for the world?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we fall a little bit short there.
Mm-hmm.
But also, sorry, just to comment on that,
Please,
the other thing it does is it makes you do what you can measure and what really matters. And I think that's the real problem. I suppose from our side, I'd say the BT pension scheme set a net zero goal about 3 years ago. And the last 3 years have, if anything, learned us that we need to be quite pragmatic, because of course, war in Ukraine, Middle East, pandemic, etc. There's been so much going on. And I suppose if you look at, and I think I think some of the learnings we've had is that if your ESG policies are not well thought through, you will risk getting caught in a geopolitical drama that you didn't expect. And Russia was a good example of that. So if you were really serious about your ESG policies, you might have a better chance of navigating some of those challenges. But I think reinforcing how quickly it goes from, in that case, you can't be invested in Russia. Or China, being a lot of pressure, especially on American businesses not investing in China. So you have all these things that are happening faster than we've been used to. And I think that drives a lot. I suppose the other thing I would say is that we live at a time where there's a cost of living crisis, and we sporadically speak about a just transition, but no one's really focusing on, not enough of our sort are focusing enough on what that really means. And I think what we're worried about, or what I'm worried about, is we can't do much if we lose the support from the members whose money we're investing. And if you, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of the UK government changing its policy, but the reason they did it, well, there could be also the reason why they did it, but it was clearly because they thought that voters would support that change, and that we've lost the support of the voters in transition we're towards. And I think we are totally underestimating that, and we think about that's an emerging market thing or something else, but it's actually also a UK thing. A lot of people haven't got enough money to pay their bills, and if they don't have that and they see this transition is going to cost them more, how can they support that? So I think we can, and again, every time I'm in a setting like this, I keep saying it, for most of us, it's probably not the energy bills we're most worried about paying, but it is for a lot of people. And if we disregard that, and we can be, super convinced about we're doing all the right things, but if it's not if it's delivering outcomes people can't sustain, then we won't get where we need to get to.
Social challenges at the core. And this is exactly right. Why I'm just sometimes wondering, we have spent a lot of time in this industry focusing on issues. Myself, I wrote a handbook on biodiversity. We've seen many climate risk trajectories happening. The real challenges now, and you highlighted it too, are around social and impact, and how can we interlink also E&S trajectories for a just transition. And again, in turn, this is not a far away problem. We have looked at just transition trajectory. I've done that on my side in the investment management industry, looking at just transition trajectories in South Africa. When we look at the metals and mining industry, for instance, or Eastern Europe, when we look at the coal sector per se. But as you highlighted, the issues are right at our doorstep.
Basic needs,
children,
shelter,
right? Exactly.
rent. Can I pay my
And
rent? Can I pay my mortgage? And a lot of people cannot, even though they may have 2 jobs. And they're making all sorts of sacrifices. It's really, really tough. I haven't seen it that tough in my lifetime so far.
And that's interesting
for the young
to hear.
people.
Very much agreed. And 1 million of children, the latest report now, in depriving poverty. And obviously the trajectory is spiraling downwards and is not obviously easing out, and or is on an upward trajectory. So maybe all of this, and Gus, sorry, bringing you here into the conversation, right into the spotlight. But what do you see as the opportunities of growth and the role of policy enablement? Again, the shortest report highlighted, we're moving away from purely risk mitigation. All what we are discussing here is thematics and impact and growth opportunities and how we can leverage these.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I'm a student of history and a student of geopolitics. And looking back over the last 30 to 50 years, I think what's really clear is that we're entering a totally new era, and it's not just net zero. It's the trifecta of that, with COVID, with increased competition around supply chain sovereignty, is changing the nature of the way that states intervene in policy. And for an economy like the UK, where we have had essentially a consensus over the last 40 years in terms of the role that the state plays in fostering industries, picking winners, that puts us in a position where we have to slightly change tack, and that's driven by external factors. We're looking at what the US is doing with the Inflation Reduction Act. We're looking at EU further away. Obviously, it's clear the amount of subsidy going in by China into their various industries. And if we want to be competitive in that new context, we've got to change the rules by which we operate as well, and the types of projects that we get involved with. I think that by nature, some of those, investment decisions which are in sustainable industries, by nature, you know that there's going to be a high degree of regulatory exposure and a high degree of exposure to state subsidy or direct state support. And my job is within the UK government, so I head up our investor relations team. We sit at the apex of what is government and regulation doing, what do institutional investors want, and what are the projects that are out there. So I try to bring all three of those together and help and advise and be a sounding board to help each of those different sides navigate the system. And it's really hard right now because we're getting asked for a lot of things that are outside of our toolkit right now, but even being asked for them helps us figure out what we need in our toolkit, if that makes sense. And if it's more subsidy, if it's more control, if it's more clarity over long-term revenue models for contracts for a difference, if it's raising the strike price for offshore wind, and as you'll know, we had the allocation round earlier. Each of these we're feeling our way, but it's not uncommon. We know we're not the only other country in the situation. We've seen, for example, with offshore wind, under subscriptions for various other countries across Europe. We've seen other countries like Finland, I think, change tack on the inflation pass-through for institutional investors into different types of assets. So these things are happening across the piece, but we're doing our best.
How do you get ahead of the game? If are you going to the lowest common denominator, or are you aiming to hit aces?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question because it gets to the heart of how do governments compete in the 21st century? Do we start to really focus in on what we're good at? And I mean, I'll give you sort of two examples there. The government has always, the UK government has always taken a technology neutral perspective, especially in support of net zero. And we basically have a model in play and a roadmap in play to try to help every single one of those succeed. Although our previous prime minister, you can guess which one it was, said that we wanted to be the Saudi Arabia of wind. And I mean, to talk about wind, the UK is blessed with 4 wonderful ports on the North Sea, which can service and provide manufacturing into the North Sea. But our competitor countries in Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium each have one main port which they can do offshore wind manufacturing, and they have a significant amount of state and municipal support and ownership going into those assets. They're able to build heavy-duty quayside infrastructure that's able to bring in manufacturers. We can't do that unless we start to pick a winner. That would be a great leap, a great change in UK government policy. I don't think we're in that space yet, but we're conscious, and it's part of the decision-making process.
Gus, I'm so pleased to hear your description of the function of the Department of Business and Trade, because I think you're absolutely right that it needs to be an interaction between government and private capital. I think there's a bit of a conceit with private capital that says, we've got this. And I think it's just wrong. I think your description of the intersection between institutional capital, regulation, and then blended finance and participation by government on blended finance, that's really where the solutions lie. And I'm not sure government, locations, local authorities, and institutional capital are talking to each other enough at this stage. But I think that's really where this happens. I mean, the notion that somehow the private market made solar happen or the private market made wind happen, that's just silly. You know, the fact of the matter is that there is a government piece component of this, even if it fades off over time. But I think that the blended finance and awareness of blended finance, I think, is really not keen enough in either government or in institutional capital.
I'm not sure I agree with that. In terms of as institutional investors, we're very keen to work with governments, but it's the communication is not happening enough. It's advancing quite a lot in the last year or so, but it's not happening enough. And so we hear things like, for example, the government wants to build 40 hospitals, or I won't pick a number, take any number, but to make that happen, we have the capital, but it has to be investable. So, how do we ensure that those cash flows are there, and how do we ensure that the returns will be sufficient to meet our fiduciary responsibilities? But the willingness is there, Jake.
The willingness. So I'm going to disagree with your disagreement.
Okay.
Only to say that the willingness is there, but is the engagement, the kind of co-creation.
No, I agree with that.
The kind of co-creation that would make this actually happen and happen in real life, that I think is underdeveloped on both sides.
I agree with that. And I suppose the other thing is the consistency in policy.
Yeah.
because you can't do
No,
that
well.
if you have inconsistency
Yeah.
or if you
I'm sure
don't
Gus knows
believe
this.
it'll last longer than the next election. So I think
Or the
that-
next prime minister.
yeah.
It's the short-termism, right? And
Yes.
sometimes the policies are at odds with market reality
Yeah.
or real economy outcomes, as you framed it. And maybe really, I think that is what everyone is picking up. If there is not a policy and regulatory drive side by side with then the enablement that also moves the sustainable capital flows, you know, we see that ultimately the longer term opportunities are being missed. And maybe that's again bringing it back to some of the surveys here as well, what really the investor, what you just highlighted, what the investor community is looking for, and where we can connect on topics such as net zero alignment or climate risk activity and action, not just out to 2050, but importantly so on a policy trajectory, right? And likewise, the same needs to be defined now as a framework for nature. And lastly, but not least, for social trajectories, as we are highlighting here. And maybe there are also specific asset classes that could enable that transition and accelerate it. And I know, Gus, you also wanted in some of our discussions to say a bit more about the asset classes, the alternative asset classes, maybe that could enable here the transition more swiftly, and then enable also maybe the information flow or the incentives, carrots and sticks between policy enablement and sustainable investment opportunities. So very keen to get your perspective there as well.
Yeah, and I mean, first, an observation, I guess, on the UK policy environment. I mean, I've spent most of my career as a commercial diplomat working in lower income countries, places where there's very frequent changes of policy, frequent changes of leader. And then I decided to take a break from that and come back here a year ago and take up this job. I mean, look, I think we're aware of what the market is looking for. We're blessed in the UK in that the best thinkers in the world on global capital markets, many of them are in London, and we get great advice and great feedback from industry the whole time. I think we're trying to pick some areas where we know that we can do really well and build on our strengths. So one area you mentioned alternatives. Our VC ecosystem is now the second biggest in the world. It's going from strength to strength. We're bringing out new financial products to enable global institutional capital to tap into that through different funds of funds models. We think there's still great upside potential for institutional investors to capitalize on. And on net zero and sort of capital deployments into those projects, we spend a lot of time trying to problem solve, because we know that there are issues out there. We know that grid connections are issues, and we're not hiding from that. In fact, we published the Windsor report into how we're going to try to speed that up, and it's really clear with what the issues are, and they're totally unacceptable. It talks about 14-year wait times for grid connections for some projects. It talks about a pipeline of grid connections which is on a first come first serve basis rather than an impact basis. And we've spotted those, and we are trying to fix and listen.
Is there maybe then also a question around building the right measurements? Is it more than that? Is it policy enablement, sustainable capital flows, impact capital flows? Is there maybe beyond disconnects? Is there a wider challenge? You highlighted challenges with data, of course, with frameworks, maybe with confusion as well, when and where trajectories are heading. And how can we overcome these jointly? Have we got the right task forces in place between, say, government enablers and or then investment decision makers and intermediaries? Is there discussion around this in the industry? Maybe Jamie, your perspective, you are having a broader view across the industry, really, and probably are convening some of these organizations.
Well, I guess my inclination is to look at the art of the possible. What is actually already happening? And Brunel is a great example of this. I mean, Brunel has really put effort into defining how it can deploy capital to do useful things for society and the environment while delivering on the fiduciary requirements of a pension fund. So I think rather than wish for the next set of data, wish for the next set of policy, wish for the next set of guidelines and frameworks, I think we could do a better job of working with what we already have. Because there's an awful lot, and it's there and it's proven, it's done in the real world, but other people aren't picking up on that as much as they could. So yes, we will constantly refine our policy and our frameworks and our data, but I think there's a lot of raw material to be working with today and there's not enough take up from asset owners to do that.
Well, one thing that I would say that's massive obstacle, that greenhouse I mentioned, we do that 10 times over all over the UK if it meant we were reducing our carbon footprint and producing food for ourselves. But planning is a really big problem, whether it's for renewable energy or, well, wind farms, classic one. It can take, it's fine as long as nobody objects. Well, give us a planning application that nobody objects to. And, yeah, and so that needs to be unlocked because planning has become so complex. Whether it's for housing, just housing alone is a really big problem. And so that's what's luring us away because it's not happening here, but we can invest elsewhere, whether it's in Canada or US or other places. It's just so much easier.
But Denise, don't you think there's an intersection between planning and then the public mood and the public preference? I mean, this takes us back to the just transition. One of the planning rules are there to reflect objections from communities largely. And I think that we haven't communicated and we haven't built investment projects in such a way to make it appealing to the community so there wouldn't be that objection. I mean, don't you think that's also part of it, is that, when you put in a wind farm or a solar array, have you connected with the local communities to explain why this is a good idea for them rather than a bad idea? Or does it just get imposed unilaterally?
I think it's evolved over time. And some of it has been to give local people the choice to create the spaces, the places and the spaces that they want to live in. But that can breed inertia because, the books and books have been written about pothole politics. And, it's that very low, at some point, leadership is about making decisions and guiding and sharing your vision for the future and carrying people with you. Now, how you do that in a NIMBY sort of mentality state is you're right, it has to be explained, but you won't necessarily get buy-in, especially if the people who are telling you that don't align with your political thinking. And so, when you have in China, for example, they can build anything,
Right.
the government decides that they just do it. Doesn't matter what people think, they just go ahead. And then they have the big disaster that they've had in property. But, there has to be a balance. And right now, at the end of the day, it's very good to consult with people. But if at the end of the day, it puts us in a situation, sticking with housing, where we are today, where people can't rent because there's nothing available, or they certainly can't buy because they can't afford it. Then, where does the leadership come in?
Correlation between policy enablement, autocratic regimes, and then
Well,
ultimately.
I didn't quite want to go down that rabbit hole, but yes, if we, that's part of the price of democracy.
The fine line that you said exactly, and it raises core questions around democratic models, of course, and increasingly so. And probably we want to see as well, not just concepts, but again, the actions and ultimately outcomes and impacts. And I think there is increasingly the challenge of aligning these different dimensions. And again, policy enablement plays a role, but I think also fiduciary management, also bringing you back in, Morten, we had that in a pre-discussion, enabling fiduciary management. And this has happened here with the Freshfield report a long while back. And we are in one of the regions, also Gus, to your point, the UK is as a fantastic representation of the entire investment management industry. And we have the right policies that set the trajectory for fiduciary management and enablement. But it will be interesting to hear now, are these trajectories still in sync and aligned? And are they actually leveraging the right opportunities? When we're hearing the examples today, I absolutely think so, but there are clearly bottlenecks and barriers still that we need to overcome. But Morten, sorry, without this.
Can I take it a little bit of different direction? Because I think one thing which is not policy problem per se, I think, is that the greening versus greenwashing versus actually delivering real outcome, I think is quite key, because I think more and more are focusing on just greening their portfolios, which is the easiest thing in the world. We have 5 emitters in our portfolio. If we got rid of them, we'd be sorted. But what would that do? And I think that thing of really thinking through and I think that's back to the data point, being so trapped in data, being so trapped in policy that doesn't really make sense because we're simplifying it too much. What really matters is what we deliver of real world outcomes. And I think what we're quite really starting to think about is how do we capture the abated emissions in our portfolio instead of focusing on buying all sorts of things that are already green. And if I give you one example of ours, which we're very pleased with, we invested in a recycling plant in Bristol called Viridor, and they are using landfill with their diverting 320,000 tons of non-recyclable household waste and creating enough energy to provide power for 84,000 homes. They're also producing plastics out of that, which is fantastic. And they're giving us so far a 30% return in the last 3 years we've been invested. Fantastic investment, ticks all the boxes. They are going to be net zero later than our ambition. So should we dump them? I'm not going to do that as long as they're going to do the right thing. I'd much rather be part of that because I think it's exactly businesses like that. And I think the other thing we're struggling with, and I think this industry is struggling with, is we are predicting so much based on past history. So when we're looking forward now, for example, when we're saying we have this, we're trying to manage towards this very ambitious goal on net zero, and a lot of our managers are saying, well, but right now, only X% of all the businesses you need to be invested in have net zero alignment, and most of them are after 2035. So that's, of course, a problem. But that's right now. And of course, what we've always said is we need other things to happen. And if you look back a little bit, a lot more companies today have net zero targets than they did 5 years ago. So you know, if you oversimplify this and say, okay, we'll just look at the easy data we have, then you know you'll make the wrong choices.
Transition trajectories with impact, and that's an interesting example you brought here, right? In alignment, but again, the question is it then only down to the prescribed frameworks that you should utilize in order to ensure that you are in line and fully compliant, or is it rather the outcomes and again the impacts that you ultimately can generate? And that is again a misalignment question, right, as well, which probably raises questions generally. Where are we heading with this? As we are seeing in the increasing focus on regulatory trajectories, framework alignment, it's all important to build rules-based approaches. And in my day job, building also products, is important to have rules-based approaches, but it cannot be everything. It raises some of the fundamental questions of our industry and where we're generally heading. Thank you for this. Before I'm asking you for some concluding statements and comments as well, and outlook and forward-looking trajectories from your own perspective on these topics, maybe opening up as well to the room here. And I'm opening up Slido. I'm sure people had the chance to take a look at the Slido link and see if I'm getting some questions on here. Please, we can also do it without technology enablement, very simply so. Please say your name and your question. Name and organization question, please.
My name is John Delco. I retired from the industry a couple of years ago, and I'm here purely as a person. One of the consequences of that decision is I spent a lot more time really just in public discourse and not in super privileged rooms like this. Great thinking. And I do miss that. The more I spend time exposed in public debate, the more depressed I get about points of view, attitudes, all the things. And I see how politics, not just actually reflects policy, but reflects in that public feeling. And, you know, not reference, but we've seen roll back to the wishes recently. And things that, you know, that's disappointing. So I boil it down. My simple question to each of the panel is: are you optimistic or are you pessimistic about achieving the required trajectories in net zero, in biodiversity, in social contracts from where you stand? What is your genuine assessment Yeah, we've been on this road quite a long time. So that would be.
Would like to take it, Denise?
I'm very much a glass half full person, but I would just say that it's a bit like random theory, or the drunk leaving the pub won't necessarily get home. He will get home, but he might be weaving around a bit as he gets there. But ultimately, we have to, because we all have a duty of care for future generations, our children and our grandchildren. But I do think things will be very difficult for the next few decades. Migration will be a massive issue. It's already starting. And countries like the UK will be very attractive to a lot of people. How will we feed everyone? How will we house them? It's going to be difficult, but I'm confident that as humans, we have always been able to adapt. So now we created this problem, we have to fix it.
Yeah, so I think I'm optimistic. I can see a world in 2040 where we have large scale net zero power generation operating at merchant risk, and I think that day is actually quite close. In the North Sea with offshore wind, we thought it was closer before the last auction, before inflation, but it won't be too far away. And the moment that you have merchant risk offshore wind combined with decent hydrogen electrolysis technology that can take the electricity from the offshore wind at no cost and convert it into hydrogen, which is then used for other purposes, then you start to have a net zero ecosystem around coastal communities and inland, which is genuinely affordable and better and lower cost than it could alternatively be. The hard part is how we get there over the next 20 years. I think that's almost inevitable, that outcome, actually. I'm certain that we will get there. It's just about the journey towards getting there. I talked about that we've been on the UK in the last 40 years has been in low intervention mode, and we're about to move into high intervention mode. I think that high intervention mode is also time limited. We're looking at high intervention for 20 years until we solve some of those problems, and then we can hopefully drop back down a little bit. It's just as Denise said, that sits alongside quite systematic demographic trends, structural trends, geopolitical trends, which are really complicated for us to manage.
And to measure and turn, absolutely. Yes, maybe here in the front row, the lady, and then absolutely afterwards there. Ladies first in this case. Please do. Apologies. Thank you so much, but that's much easier.
So I'm Marion Boria. I look after this sustainability for a global steel manufacturer, and then on the other side of the fence, that's the board of USX. Building on the last question, I'm interested in what happens if we don't. So do we make it? We're investing heavily in trying to make it, but how much of your time and headspace goes into thinking about building resilience in a world in which we don't get there in time, and investing in some of the solutions that might help us with that?
Scenario planning. Thank you.
I think if I take from our perspective, I suppose the logic for our net zero ambition is risk management effectively. And yes, there's opportunity also, but a lot of it is how do we manage those risks the best possible way. And so what we are trying to do is to assess the exposure of the assets we have to climate risk. And so it's a little bit backward in that sense, but that's what we're doing. And of course, you could say, again, how much could we be investing more in dikes or whatever you need to start to prevent some of this, and I'm sure we could. But again, I think, sorry, if I look at it from a UK perspective, I think government could help us get more of those types of opportunities, which will be needed, and make the environment for that attractive for us as investors. So I think there's some thinking, but not enough thinking is probably the answer.
I would just add, if you take a just transition lens, which is what the Impact Investing Institute is doing, and capture the environmental and social and community dimensions to problems, it means that even as you're working on the environmental problems, you're simultaneously working on the implications for society. So I think the mitigation of not getting there is embedded in the just transition approach.
Thank you. The gentleman in the back. I think the one next to you on the other side was first, and then of course the one after. Thank you.
Hi there, Nigel Kershaw, Chair of the Big Issue Group. Obsessed with I'm coming back to your question here. Obsessed with the democratization of finance. This is why I co-founded the Big Exchange and so on. And it's if we're going to get people to make change, we have to learn, in my view, and that's how we do this, to talk to people in languages they can understand that drives change. So I love just transition. I talked to somebody the other day who said just transition. They look at you, you can talk about a ton of carbon. What does that mean for me in a high cost of living crisis in terms of my bills and so on and so forth? So I think we have to, as in just transition, relate this to the social, but we have to learn how to, so the question is, I know I'm meant to ask a question, I never do. So the question is, how do we talk to people in a language and a way, the people's money we look after in pension or insurance or whatever, in a way that can understand and they can help to drive the change so it becomes a bottom up, becomes a movement, not just a protest movement, a movement for change. And I think that's our responsibilities.
Very interesting comment. After years, we looked for terms and definitions to actually classify ESG as an industry. And I would actually challenge that. We had that discussion. It's a mainstream. We should really find the right language and maybe the right tone to address the stakeholders. That's something we should all be good at. That's what we do in our day-to-day business.
But can I just say one quick thing on that?
Morten,
I think the one thing I at least took from Brexit is Project Fear doesn't work.
Yeah.
That narrative doesn't work
right.
with a lot of people who have had a bad outlook and have a future outlook that's not great.
Yeah.
So, and I think our dialogue around climate change and biodiversity is very centered around the losses we have, and we cry when we see the David Attenborough
extinction, exactly.
or whatever it is. But we have to start to have a narrative about what is the good we can come out of, what is that world we can create, a world with cheap energy, a world of all sorts of that. It has to come with both of those narratives.
Fully agreed.
Martina, sorry, just a quick thing. Talking about what Nigel was saying, we've had a speaker in 1 year, Richard Curtis, the film director, who co-founded Make My Money Matter. And it is all about that. It's about getting everybody to care, because the point is the investment community are tasked with delivering returns. If they can make the world a better place along the way, that's great. But the question is, what are they going to be measured on, and what are they going to be thrown out of the client by? So it is a big challenge that everybody here is, they're all supposed to have big shoulders and take on the world and fix the problems. But actually, we all still want high returns, and we all still want the things that we want. So it is this all-encompassing challenging that we all have to take on board, I think.
It is a system change. We need to think in small chunks to address the broader consumer base, the communities, and we need to think higher level in order to build the right policy enablement and ultimately investment allocation strategies. And that is the fine balance. And I know, Adrian, you're looking on your watch. We are probably running very late. We have a last minute. I'm sure people can maybe read the last question, and then we can continue the conversation after the next, obviously, keynote and panel during the coffee break. Please.
Mark Tennant from Country Landowners. Just quickly from Gus's perspective, the next connection that the grid is offering, a decent size solar farm or wind farm, is 2037. Makes your 2040 target a little bit difficult to achieve. But my question isn't that. The panel will remember back in the 70s that when we had very high inflation, we instituted a thing called inflation cost accounting, where all companies had to report their report and accounts, their annual report, but beside it, they had to inflation adjust those figures, which were then audited, and there were some rules, very clear rules as to how that was done. Is there any reason, and would it not be helpful in terms of an answer a little bit to what Morten was saying about measurement, that actually we have carbon adjusted accounts, which actually then puts all the investments on the same footing with clear rules, which are audited, going down to companies which are in excess of the VAT threshold?
I think that concept more or less exists with impact-related accounts, in which the financial accounts are counterbalanced against the externalities, the damage they create to society and environment. So in a sense, that concept is out there. The question is, how do you get people to pay attention to the cost of the externalities?
Require
Well, we're not quite there yet, but.
Comes back to frameworks, rules-based approaches, and maybe the question, do we need more regulation? And maybe policy enablement that goes alongside this, and incentives, carrots and sticks. Thank you so much. I think we really have, unfortunately, to break the conversation here. I would like to thank this fantastic panel, and also for having these great discussions and exchanges, and for Gus making the time, also engaging with pension fund community and the others in the value chain, and likewise Denise and Morten and Jamie joining and sharing perspectives on how we are already working and delivering for outcomes and impacts. Wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. And to you all. Thank you.